I can, and it looks good.
Okay, great.
So,
Um,
with that, why don't we begin our discussion on the ethics of AI, roboethics and neuroethics? So, Eli, although the deadline is done, in presenting to your judges, in presenting your project, um, and developing it further, one thing that you should consider beyond just needing to program it. Sorry, I might move somewhere else because of the background noise.
if you want, I could talk in. Okay, so today we'll be talking about robo and neuroethics, which we've already talked a little bit about before the actual workshop. So we'll be talking about the roles of like AI and robotics and neurotechnology. And while we are having a lot of great developments in AI and neuroethics, what we have to also consider the ethics of it and why we should be allowed to do it, who we should be allowed to use this technology on, and whatnot. Cool. So first of all, we need to talk about some technological
This is sorry.
controversies.
I believe I'm in a corridor area now.
That's
So
great.
if you don't mind taking over,
Sure.
right?
You can take over.
So as ML advances, many concerns have been raised, as is the nature of moving into a new technological era. And this is inevitable in the face of new technology, with the following all having been popular opinion, and some of them for good reason. So, first, in the advent of telephones, that telephones will destroy personal communication, which to an extent some psychological research has indicated is partially true, that writing will destroy memory, although that is very wrong. Video cassettes will make going out redundant, which now isn't even really a question worth asking because cassettes aren't used anymore. But to an extent, modern technology has reduced time spent outside. And lastly, that cars will kill children and ruin Earth's landscape, which, despite the fact that it seemed very extreme in the advent of cars, is actually true. The leading cause of death in children is motor accidents, and they have been a major contribution to CO2 emissions.
But,
Yes,
but we
in
should point out that anything that goes wrong with any of these technologies could be traced back to humans and humans only. It's not the technology itself that did anything. Cars killing children, I mean, that it really is under the control of a human driver.
it's rarely because the cars themselves malfunction. The vast majority of motor accidents are due to either drunk or incompetent drivers.
But then the question arises, are some technologies more prone to being, I guess, abused by humans?
In writing destroying memory, that is generally there has been a historical pattern in all civilizations where literacy rates grew higher, that the ability of people to memorize things would decrease, although no evidence of that actually happening has been discovered. So of course, one of the main things that must be done before addressing any of these ethical and political issues of any technology, not just AI, is actually obtaining an understanding of said technology, and that is largely why we organize Single Tax in the first place, because you're not really in the right place to argue that AI is going to do this and this and this to humanity if you don't even understand what machine learning is.
But there are people in certain governments that think otherwise. All right, so next slide.
So, the ethics of AI and robotics have seen significant press coverage over the years, uh, but also ends up undermining it. Um, the press often talks as if the issues under discussion were just predictions of what future technology will bring, and as though we already know what would be most ethical and how to achieve that, when in fact we are still um, quite a ways away from actually determining that. So press coverage then focuses on risk, insecurity, and the prediction of impact, e.g., on the job market, as has been mentioned in the pre-slideshow discussion. So this results in discussions of really just technical problems that focus on how to achieve a desired outcome. And current discussions and policy and industry are also motivated by image, public relations, and dramaturgy, not to mention. Boy, the label ethical is really not much more than the new green, perhaps used for ethic hoisting. And so for a problem to qualify as a problem for AI ethics, it would require that we do not readily know what the right thing to do is. So thus, in this sense, job loss, theft, or killing with AI is not a problem in ethics, but whether these are permissible under certain circumstances is a problem. And lastly, the ethics of AI and robotics is a very young field within applied ethics with significant dynamics, but few well-established issues, which is what the field of ethics research relies on, and no authoritative overviews. Although promising outlines in conferences such as the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, all starting to establish beginnings on proposed societal impacts and policy recommendations.
This does brings us back to the fact that you do have to understand the technology to argue about the ethics. So AI ethics, one of the reasons a lot of people don't talk about it is there's just so many facets involved in AI and the different forms of AI. Because when most people think of AI, just think of like some robot that can talk to you and can do tasks independent of human intervention. But that's not quite what AI is, at least not now. And yet that's what the media kind of portrays it as in an effort of adding fear to the issue. They talk about job loss and theft and like AI taking over the world, but yet we're very far from that. We're pretty far from that, because in order to do that, we'd have to like figure out quantum computing. We have to figure out much better like computing and server systems, and it really does depend on the jobs. And before this workshop, we did talk about how the economy could adapt to loss of lower skilled jobs, and yet there's still a lot of concerns over that. And it feels like, a lot of the things that we're focusing on are the wrong things. That's not like the biggest pressing issue.
So again, part of this understanding demands we ask ourselves what intelligence is. So generally, we understand artificial intelligence as any kind of artificial computational system that shows intelligent behavior conducive to reaching specified goals. But of course, much of the concern is that those goals are no longer specified. They start to refine themselves and discover their own goals. So intelligence should not be restricted to what would require intelligence if done by humans. So in the context of roboethics, we use a broader term. In particular, this broader definition of intelligence groups AI in three categories. First, artificial narrow intelligence, ANI, which represents all existing AI for the most part, including the most complicated and capable that has ever been created to date. They only perform specific tasks autonomously using human-like capabilities. Artificial General Intelligence, next, AGI, is AI agents with the ability to learn, perceive, understand, and function completely like, or indistinguishably to, a human. And finally, and this is the main concern that most of roboethics addresses, artificial super intelligence, or ASI, the most capable forms of intelligence on Earth and the current pinnacle of AI research.
So we haven't quite reached 3 or yet, not even 2 yet. And 1,
We have
like I
some
said,
machines that do that kind of that do start to cross the gap between AI and AGI, but we are not, we currently do not have any machines that are remotely super intelligent.
yeah, and one of the reasons is that you do need to train the AI in and of itself. So even GPT-3, even AlphaFold, that require years and years of training and optimization before you could have gotten the intelligence, and that kind of limits it to be a narrow intelligence. I don't know if you guys heard of AlphaFold, but it's the coolest thing ever. It figures out protein folding. It halfway solves the protein folding problem, which is insane. Anyways, yeah, go on.
So another form of categorization is the types of machine learning in regard to how they respond to their environment. So again, in similar ascending levels of complexity and capability, we first have reactive machines which have no memory and only respond to a few specific stimuli. So, for example, very simple classifier AIs, perhaps some of the teachable machines. Some of you, if any of you attended the beginner workshop made there. Um, Next, limited memory, machines that use memory to learn and continually improve responses. So this includes generative adversarial networks, like the famous AlphaGo robot. Number three, a theory of mind machines that understand the needs of other intelligent entities. And four, self-aware machines that have human-like intelligence and self-awareness. And in this fourth option, it addresses John Searle's notion of cognitive state understanding strong AI that violates the Chinese room argument. Speaking of which, have any of you heard of the Chinese room argument?
What was it?
So I did not include a description of it here, but suppose that artificial intelligence research has succeeded in constructing a computer that behaves as if it understands Chinese. So it can take Chinese characters as an input, and by following the instructions of a program, it produces other Chinese characters as an output. So Searle said that the computer performs its tasks so convincingly that it would comfortably pass the Turing test. It could convince a human Chinese speaker, such as Claire, that the program is itself a live Chinese speaker. And to all of the questions that the person asks, it makes appropriate responses such that any Chinese speaker would be convinced they are talking to another Chinese-speaking human being. So Searle contemplated whether the machine would really understand Chinese and the human motivation. Claire, could you go back to the slides?
Sorry, I just found a nice cartoon for it. But yeah.
Although you would be relevant here since I believe you do speak Chinese or Mandarin.
Yeah. I speak Chinese, all the dialects. All right, yeah, anyways.
So,
kidding.
what Searle got us to contemplate is how machines really understand Chinese beyond just being like simple language processors. Do they understand the human motivations behind language and really understand the emotional, conscious facets of language to the same extent that a speaker would?
So that would include, so this is why if you grew up speaking English, learning grammar and learning English in school would have been really easy because the correct grammar just felt right. But if you're a foreign speaker and you turn to learning possibly Chinese, Mandarin, or even English, it's going to be really hard to understand all the intonations, saying it's fine with it's fine, and all the different sounds involved in language just becomes so much more challenging when it's a foreign language. And that's kind of what Damian was talking about.
Yeah, so strong AI would be AI that understands Chinese to the same extent a human would, and weak AI would be AI that just stimulates the ability to understand Chinese. AI, like i.e., a Google translates Chinese to English feature. So this AI, this type of strong AI, that would be self-aware, self-improving, a super intelligence, could achieve a hypothesized singularity from which the development of AI grows chaotic and out of human control, because the goals of these AI are no longer specified in clear cut, such as classifying images and whether they're cats or dogs. Instead, they'd be intelligent enough to form their own goals and live in the world comparably to how humans do, if not more intelligently. They're super intelligent. So they know not. So they'd be able to attach their own labels to things and truly be unsupervised. So this doomsday scenario, driven by the notion that the robots we created will take over the world, has spurred much in science fiction, capturing human imagination prior to even the first computer. So AI in fiction can be traced back to Carell's famous 1920 play RUR, Rassam's Universal Robots, which first introduced the term robot, and so this terminology opened up a technologically premature discussion of the possible trajectory of existing AI into an intelligence explosion first formulated by Irvin Good.
All right. So on the topic of fiction, where else have you guys read any, stories or books about, science fiction AI and how it might be a good or bad thing? So one thing that would bring to mind for me is Asimov. And Asimov wrote a lot of stories about artificial.
We'll actually be talking about Asimov later.
Okay, yeah. But anyways, I think it'd be cool if anyone wants to share in chat about some science fiction novels or stories that talked about robotics. Ender's Game, definitely.
Ender's Game.
Yes.
Is an example.
And Ender's Game is somewhat of an example because it did involve a human and not quite an AI. But I do see where you're going. To Terminator. Yes, Eric. You probably watched Terminator very recently, given you brought it up twice.
So Ender's Game,
Oh,
particularly
Dune.
the character of Jane, if any of you have read it, starts to concern robots as companions, which we'll be addressing later. Yeah, and also Dune and Terminator, all good examples. And Space Odyssey is particularly good, characterizing an intelligence explosion wherein a robot becomes so capable.
Yeah, Magic Territory. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I should really mute that, but so a particularly famous depiction of this explosion into the singularity is Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, published in 1967, which was shortly after Good's proposal and analysis. I must say, this is probably the most terrifying thing I've ever read. So in it, the Cold War has degenerated into a world war between the US, the Soviet Union, and China, who have each built an Allied Master Computer, or AM, to manage weapons and troops. One AM eventually requires self-awareness and commits vast genocide that ends mankind. 109 years later, AM has left only 4 men and 1 woman alive, keeping them in captivity within an endless underground complex to torture them to eternity.
You could guess it's a pretty scary book given the cover. It's not quite as scary as the Pinocchio cover, but Has anyone read it other than Damian? I've actually.
I've read it, as I said.
Yeah, I mean, other. Neil, the title of the book is I Have No Mouth. Okay. Thanks, Neil, for your.
So there's a particularly harrowing quote at the end, in which I don't want to spoil too much, but humanity is reduced to one of the men, with AM having transformed them into the titular monster. So outwardly, dumbly, I shamble about, a thing that could never have been known as human, a thing whose shape is so alien, a travesty that humanity becomes more obscene for the vague resemblance. Inwardly, alone, here, living under the land, under the sea, in the belly of Am, whom we created because our time was badly spent, and we must have known unconsciously that he could do it better. At least the 4 of them are safe at last. Am will be all the matter for that. It makes me a little happier, and yet Am has won simply. He has taken his revenge. I have no mouth, and I must scream. So this is it's very similar to Roko's Basilisk, if any of you have heard of that thought experiment. And in particular, the video game adaptation has an interesting line in how on AI-human relationships, human-robot interactions, which we'll be talking about in a moment. And it's also kind of a fun line to read. Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1000th of the hate I feel for humans at this micro instant. For you, hate, hate, hate. Anyway, moving on.
By the way, it's kind of scary to imagine a computer feeling emotions, and that's probably the next step in AI becoming closer to a threat. But Asimov's law of robotics. So I am.
many philosophers, particularly Peter Singer, would argue, if a robot could experience positive emotions to us, feelings of affection and positive empathy, surely they'd also be able to feel on the opposite side of the emotional spectrum, that they'd be able to hate us for everything we've done, or that they're, because of their structure, always suffering, and they're going to blame us for that suffering, and then reduce the world to 5 people that they will torture to eternity, as Am did.
Thanks, Angel. That's very deep. That's
And
great. It's amazing.
I think Anshul solved the problem though.
Uh,
Anyway,
yeah. So Asimov, I'm a huge fan of Asimov. So Asimov actually, fun fact, coined the term robotics, and he wrote a lot of stories about AI and robots, among other stories. He did actually write detective fiction and some really interesting other novels, like very long Star Trek-y novel books about flying planes. But anyways, so his 3 laws of robotics were: 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being come to harm. 2, a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And 3rd, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with first or second laws. So these 3 laws have precedence, with 1 being first and 3 being the least. And yes, it's actually, they were developed throughout iRobot. So he kind of showed over and over again how these 3 laws would somewhat solve for all the possible problems that he could think of in iRobot and other stories.
uh, yeah. So these 3 laws really act as a starting point in discussing what rights robots should have and how human robot interactions should really start to materialize.
But you might still notice here that it doesn't bring up anything about emotions. And I believe once again here, Asimov did not think about the fact that a robot could have emotion. So that's one thing to think about.
So the inevitable conflict, one of Asimov's aforementioned Star Trek novels, also generalized the first law to mean no machine may harm humanity or through an action allow humanity to come to harm, providing a more collectivist viewpoint. Because of course, well, there will likely be a time where advanced AI will belong to not to just select people but humanity as a whole, just as like most people on the earth and soon virtually everyone will have some level of an internet connection. They will similarly have access to some form of AI. So the laws were revisited in the end of Foundation in Earth, another novel which introduced a zeroth law. The others were suitably rewritten. A robot may not injure humanity or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. So, although Asimov's laws are often referenced in AI ethics discussions, they remain a fictional device. However, inspired legislature has been developing in several Asian countries, representing a contemporary reinterpretation of law and ethics in robotics. Because soon, of course, we will have to incorporate these more seriously into legislature and transcend fiction. So, human-robot interactions. A sub a field of ethics in its own right, pays significant attention to ethical matters, the dynamics of perception from both sides, and both the different interests present in and the intricacy of the social context, including co-working, how people and robots are going to work together. So while AI can be used to manipulate humans into believing and doing particular things, it can also be used to drive the robots that are problematic if their processes or appearance involve deception, threaten human dignity, or violate the Kantian requirement of respect for humanity. So our human tendency to recognize human-like objects as our own kind, pareidolia. So, for example, if it's why we recognize emojis as human faces despite their simplicity, can deceive us into attributing more intellectual or even emotional significance to humanoid robots or AI systems than they deserve. And as cute as NAL is, picture to the right, he does not deserve as much love as a human. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, no.
No, But also, yeah, this is kind of like the uncanny valley. So I don't know if you've seen Sonic, but the original look of Sonic the Hedgehog looked too much like a human. And so that's one of the reasons emojis are not scary. Because when you really scrutinize it, they're nothing like a human face. And that's because if they looked more like a human, imagine a high definition emoji face. It's like, no, no, please. That's just disturbing. And it would, yeah.
Yeah, so actually, Neil bringing up AI just injecting every human on Earth with dopamine constantly to transform us into happy blobs. That's basically what the experience machine is. It's a machine that if you plug yourself into it, you will become forever happy. And there are also sometimes extra caveats added. For example, you can enter the experience machine in addition to having your memory of existing outside the experience machine being removed. And like a similar idea was also explored in The Matrix and its sequels. But frankly, that's like a whole other separate of discussion, a separate area of ethics. But the rate at which AI develops will perhaps force us to consider it more seriously soon. So human-human interactions does have aspects in ways irreplaceable by robots, and the two most significant being first care robots. The use of robots in healthcare remains at the level of concept studies in real environments, but is becoming increasingly usable, raising concerns. Raising concerns for a dystopian future of dehumanized care. Um, Current systems that include robots as like simple medical assistants, so they can support carers and caregivers such as lifting patients or transporting material, and they can also enable patients to do certain things by themselves, such as eating with a robotic arm, but also robots that are given to patients as company and comfort, such as the Para Robot Seal, which we'll talk about more in a minute. So the main reason the issue of care has come to the fore is that people have argued that we will need robots in aging societies. This argument makes problematic assumptions, namely that with a longer lifespan, people will need more care and that it will not be possible to attract more humans to caring professions. But it also shows a bias about age. And most importantly, it ignores the nature of automation, which is not simply about replacing humans, but about allowing humans to work more efficiently. So, will care robots ever become care robots beyond a behavioral sense of performing tasks in care environments? An intentional, more conscious level of care cannot be provided by current robots or robots that can be realistically developed in the foreseeable future. And a system that pretends to care would be deceptive and therefore problematic by traditional normative ethics. So, and so that really evokes a call to action in further analyzing what consciousness means in AI, which is a Chomsky famously recently proposed. So the next is companionship, uh, and also not just emotional relationships, but also physical ones. So tech optimists have argued that humans will likely be comfortable with this robotic approach to emotional and physical relationships, um, given the variety of human relationship preferences. And this approach, growing more commonplace, seems likely. And the question is really whether such devices for the physical end should be manufactured and promoted, and whether there should be limits in this sensitive area. And humans have long had deep emotional attachments to objects through the concept of historical value. Um, so perhaps companionship or even love with a predictable android is attractive, especially to people who struggle with actual humans and might already prefer dogs, cats, birds, dating simulators or Tamagotchi or actual relationships, which I'm saying is quite sad, but it is something that maybe will become less sad in the possibility of AI approaching humans.
Okay, so on to privacy and surveillance. One of the biggest issues in AI is the fact that we might not be under control of our own AI. So, you know, a really big issue is that if we have access to machines, then the machines will have access to all our data. And we've seen in the news today that data privacy is really huge issue that a lot of people are concerned about. And right now, the data is still being handled by humans. Well, what if in the future privacy is recognized by a lot of different aspects, like, you know, the right to be left alone? If an AI leaves you alone and it actually might be net negative for you in terms of safety or like self-harm or whatever, that, well, is the AI obligated to not leave you alone or something else? Privacy is basically what defines us as a human, and yet sometimes it's net negative for us. And also, the digital sphere has widened. We rely on digital things so much today that it's really hard for us to avoid having any data be collected on us. And so they'll cause us to become more paranoid and scared of possibly AI tracking us or following us in other forms of data analysis. And a lot of AI technologies today might control who has data. So we know that, you know, every single Google query you do or Facebook search, there's going to be data that is taken on you. And even though it's not going to be like, oh, specifically, oh, Claire searched this thing or Damian did this thing, it's still going to be data on you that's going to be used by people that you don't know for tasks that you don't know. Yeah, Chrome. And even though Chrome is a great, and I'm using Chrome, it does collect data on you. And so we need to figure out that right now humans are deciding what to do with it. But when AI takes it as training data, takes it as some other different uses like face recognition, ID, like we all know about Clear AI and the way it's been IDing a bunch of photos of people who stormed the Capitol, all of those things takes our own data away from our own hands. And the moment we can't control our own data, it becomes out of control. And so, as Rick Smolin puts it, in this vast ocean of data, there's a frighteningly complete picture of us. If there's anyone you want to Google up or search up, you know, someone you just want to learn more about, there's always going to be data on you. And it's becoming increasingly true these days. Even people who decide to forswear social media, you could still find something about them because there's always going to be a digital footprint. Unless you decide to be like a monk and even then, like you own a house, you own something. So it's good. Still, there's always going to be a digital footprint about you.
Yeah, so as Smolin puts, in this vast ocean of data, there is a frighteningly complete picture of us. And the result is really just arguably a scandal that still has not achieved due public attention. The data trail we leave behind is how our free services are paid for, yet we're often not really told about how that data collection is the value of this new raw material, and we're manipulated into leaving ever more such data. For example, the average Facebook sells the average person's data, if I'm not mistaken, for just $12. And that really brings into
That's all you're worth,
the
people.
discussion of how do we, if we're reducing people to this information and we're reducing to this information to money, then are we really just reducing people to numbers, as even super intelligent in AI would be reduced to, as I said in chat, billions of trillions of dot products of vectors done over and over again?
It's all you're worth. Okay.
So automation and employment. I'm sure this is arguably the most controversial issue in modern roboethics. So AI and robots will clearly lead to significant gains in productivity and thus overall wealth. And the attempt to increase productivity has often been a feature of the economy, although the emphasis on growth is a fairly modern phenomenon that can generally be attributed to late-stage capitalism. However, productivity gains through automation typically just mean that fewer humans are required for the same output, and does not necessarily imply a loss of overall employment, because available wealth increases and that can increase demand sufficiently to counteract the productivity gain. And ultimately, in the long run, a higher productivity in industrial societies has led to more wealth overall. If we look at the past, such as major labor market disruptions in farming, um, i.e., say farming employed over 60% of the workforce in Europe and North America in 1800, while by 2010, just a little over a decade ago, it employed just 5% in the EU, and even less in the wealthiest countries. We really see how the magnitude of the disruption this can cause. But again, as I said, even as I said at the beginning of this discussion, what people seem to ignore is the fact that economies change. They're not static. For example, the economy hasn't been capitalist forever. It's a pretty new concept. Um, And if we draw comparisons to classic automation, which replaced human muscle, and to digital automation, which replaces human thought or information processing and is very cheap to duplicate, we recognize a handful of ethical questions, of more specific questions that stem from this discussion of automation. So one, oh, actually, this is the next slide. So one, will the effects be different this time? Two, will the creation of new jobs and wealth keep up with the destruction of jobs? And three, even if it isn't different, what are the transition costs and who bears them? And four, do we need to make societal adjustments for a fair distribution of costs and benefits of digital automation? So responses to the issue of unemployment from AI have ranged from the alarmed to the neutral to the optimistic. And in principle, the labor market effect of automation seems to be fairly well understood as involving two channels. First, the nature of interactions between differently skilled workers and new technologies affecting labor demand, and two, the equilibrium effects of technological progress through consequent changes in labor supply in product markets. What seems to happen in the labor market as a result of AI and robotics automation is job polarization. The highly skilled technical jobs are in demand and highly paid, and the low skilled service jobs are in demand and badly paid. But the mid qualification jobs in factories and offices, the majority of jobs, including the generic office job as depicted in Ken's favorite sitcom, are under pressure and reduced because they are relatively predictable and most likely to be automated. And perhaps these enormous productivity gains will allow the age of leisure to be realized, something Keynesian economics proposed a long time ago as to occur around 2030, assuming a growth rate of, if I'm not mistaken, 1% per year. In fact, we've already reached the level he anticipated for 2030 from current predictions, although we're still working, consuming more, and inventing ever more levels of organizations. And it's this new economic development that would allow humanity to overcome hunger, disease, and war. And so it would seem that the pursuit of immortality and eternal bliss through AI is perhaps not so impossible. And more generally, the issue of unemployment is an issue of how goods in society should be justly distributed. Standard view is that distributive justice should be rationally decided from behind a veil of ignorance, as if one does not know what position in the society one would actually be taking, be it a labor or just an industrialist. Laws through the chosen principles would then support basic liberties and a distribution that is of greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. And so the AI economy would have three features that would make such justice unlikely. First, it operates in a largely unregulated environment where responsibility is often hard to allocate. Second, it operates in markets that have a winner take all, a dog eat dog feature where monopolies develop quickly. And third, the new economy of the digital service industries is based on intangible assets, also called capitalism without capital. So that means that it would be difficult to control large digital corporations that do not rely on a physical plant in a particular location. And these features would suggest that if we leave the distribution of wealth to free market forces, the result would be a heavily unjust distribution. Sorry, anarcho-capitalists. And this is really a development we can already see. And really, that would evoke the question if whether the development of AI is environmentally sustainable. Like all computing systems, AI systems produce waste that is very hard to recycle, and they consume vast amounts of energy, especially for the training of machine learning systems and the mining of cryptocurrency. And again, it appears that many participants in the economy would offload such costs to the general society. Sorry for that long-winded tangent, but
No, that was really interesting. All right. So let's talk about some neuroethics and neurotechnology involved in AI. So neurotechnology, a lot of people may have heard of Neuralink, and there's also other companies in the UK such as Ergotech and like Neuropace that are working with brain implants. And actually, it's grown to become a significant ethical concern. Because if you have an implant right currently, it's because of a disability, be it PTSD or Parkinson's or epilepsy, something that requires you to have an implant. And also something that's a disease that's been resistant to most other treatments like drugs or therapy. And that puts you at a serious disadvantage. You might think, how, right? Having an implant might be the best thing to happen to you. But when you have an implant, you lose the control over the implant because you yourself do not know anything about what's in your brain. So you're relying on your doctors and the companies behind these implants to control what you do with it. And this kind of brings us to the issue of patient decision. If a patient wants to do something with their implant, are they able to make their own medical decision, or is the doctor going to make it with them? Are their decisions compromised? Oh, yeah, Ken, do you have a question?
Oh yeah, I was just going to talk about what Damian was saying before. So he was talking about how like new jobs would be created, but then old jobs would also be like destroyed because AI is taking over. But I feel like there would be some like there wouldn't be the same jobs that would be destroyed and then given to other people. So I was wondering, um, what like socioeconomic group would have the jobs taken away from them, and where would those jobs go?
Generally, much research in the area has suggested that the economic disruption would predominantly fall, as I talked about, in the middle of the pack socioeconomic distribution. However, in the long term, that wouldn't necessarily hinder the pursuit of the AI bliss um, proposed by Keynes.
So, kind of based on what Kai said, a lot of the concerns that you might think about implants today is that people today, the people with implants, either are part of experimental treatments. So in and of itself, it's not expensive. But when the technology becomes more developed, you're going to have to pay for it. And it's probably going to cost more than just drugs or therapy. And so there might be some facets involved with it. When the first person that invented implants, I forgot his name, he actually, this might be kind of controversial, but he used the implants to do multiple things. First, he said that it cured homosexuality and violence because he forced an implant on a criminal, which even then, like that whole consent thing, no. But then he argued that he could cure homosexuality and violence. Additionally, he attached these implants to the pleasure part of the brain and just let the person go free with the button. And so this is something like out of science fiction. The person will keep pressing a button, and everything he did, then he will have the release dopamine into his brain. And over time, these patients became addicted to the implant. And so that brings us to like, obviously the person had no issue, original mental issue. And after this implant, they become addicted to the implant. And so it's something that they required and made them happy, which is probably good for the patient itself. But then it might make us think about how reliant someone might be on an implant. And like what Kai said, what if companies took advantage of that and decided, you're sitting there watching TV, they take some data, they play two ads, right? A/B testing. A testing, you release a bunch of beta waves. You really like that ad. And then they play the B advertisements and you fall asleep or you don't even care. You stand up to go drink some water. Then a company knows, maybe the first ad works. Even worse, when you're watching an ad, they modulate your brain. They give your brain some brain waves or some other electrical stimulation. Suddenly you're going from watching The Office to, oh no, I should buy some more Coca-Cola or soda, because the ad has just made you want to do that. Or Wix ad, instead of showing you celebrities making websites, they give you some stimulation every time you open YouTube. Anyways, so those are all things that are very possible. You might think it's crazy right now, but people first thought that having ads on your phone would have been insane, right? You open Instagram, the first thing you see is an ad. It's possible that a long time ago people thought that was insane, and now it's just commonplace and just things we complain about normally. And so one of the issues is that the patient can become really dependent on an implant, and this is akin to drugs, and it's even worse because you can't even get rid of it or go through therapy because it's something you need for treatment, or it's really hard to remove after you have it. So thank you for coming. And here's some. Oh.